Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the tax class. Um, Taxation as a subject is very robust. Lot of developments keep happening around it all the while. What you also have are these range of changes which will keep right in the middle of the semester when we will have the Finance Act. Nevertheless, let's just see how it turns out to be, because you will have certain statutory changes being introduced, and amendments coming in place even thereafter. See, the way in which we usually go ahead with a taxation course at our university is we try to get a balance of both technicality and law part of it, right? Being a law university, and all of us being law students and not studying chartered accountancy, the emphasis will be more on legal controversies rather than trying to unbundle the technical nitty-gritties, right? Because that's the domain area of our counterparts who are dealing in accountancy. Nevertheless, see, at times it is also critical that we do not leave out the mathematics or the accountancy which is involved, because that provides us a good grounding to even appreciate the controversy which is involved in a better sense, right? So do keep this in mind throughout the course. Wherever the technical part is involved, it is basically to further enable us to scope that area, as well as to get a good grounding, in understanding from where we are coming, right? So uh, the more popular part in tax, or I would say why taxation is very infamous, is because it is found to be full of these technical detailing, and is also considered very intimidating to those who can't do the math. Right now, of course, we will not go into those kinds of detailing unless, of course, it is necessary for us to do so. Having clarified that at the outset, let's just engage with these two critical questions one at a time. First, to ask ourselves, why do we need taxation? If I was to ask you, why do we need to tax? What would your response be? You can type your response in the chat box. I have opened a whiteboard on the screen. I hope that whiteboard is visible. Yeah, okay, the whiteboard is
Oh,
visible. I'm already getting the responses in the chat box. One, the very first response which was given is to say that we tax people because, one, for the purposes of revenue generation. There was this next connect which is being made that it is for the welfare and the governance. Um, the other one is on the similar lines, that it provides resources for ensuring social economic rights, to run the government and to provide these kinds of public goods. And consequently, yes, if you are operating as a welfare government in the present times, you would want this kind of a funding, right? A public financing of sorts to provide that kind of a public good, to create those infrastructures, to provide all those kinds of protection, to run the government, to run the courts, right? And consequently, this is something which essentially is a mode of public financing. These responses that all of you have given feeds into that larger theory with which we all are well versed, is that, see, looked at from this perspective, taxation is therefore a very essential offshoot of the social contract that we entered into, right? Would you agree with that kind of a statement? That taxation, in that sense of terms, is a fiscal social contract, which is now supplementing, that kind of agreement which we all made with each other when we were living in that natural state of affairs. Uh, One thing is, and of course, the counter has come in into the chat box that you may not always necessarily associate taxation with welfare aspects, because even under dictatorships, you do, subject your, people to these kinds of taxes, right? So we need to find a deeper grounding in terms of answering this question as to why exactly do we need taxes. One part of it is being found from that social contract theorizing that we do. That if we had all agreed to set up that central authority which will govern things for us, then we therefore need to enable that central, governing authority so as to provide us with all those kinds of arrangement. Consequently, it is an agreement which all of us have entered into, right? That's one part of it. The other critical part, uh, which also, and this discussion, mind you, will also uh, feed into the goals of taxation that we would ultimately also spell out for ourselves, right? So provisioning of public goods, so as to then have all these kinds of enabling environments in order to maintain law and order, to make the government, fulfill its welfare objectives, is something which is a critical aspect of taxation, and hence revenue augmentation is required for public financing. Apart from this kind of the public financing goals of taxation, what else can also be the reason why we want to impose taxes? Anything else that might come to your mind, that when we impose taxes, we often take from someone, we take those contributions, income redistribution, right? The wealth distribution which happens, right? And in fact, it is this income redistribution, this kind of wealth redistribution aspects of taxation, which have received lot of criticism, from scholars and from various theorists, right? Because one view is, and you will be able to, draw those connects with the theorizing which you would have done earlier in your, earlier years, is to say that when one is taxed, you are actually making that person do a forced labor, right? So it's like if 30% of my salary goes into taxes, then it essentially means that the government is taking that 30%, which was the fruit of my labor, for that much time, therefore, the one which is the time which I put in, which is attributable to that 30%, means that I'm forced to work without pay, right? Because that part is something which is taken away from the government. And this actually should not be allowed. Why? Because you will have theorists who support this kind of a view that labor needs to be incentivized. The moment you start taxing people in the way you do, it will actually work as a disincentive. And if the ones who are working hard become disincentivized, the pie that you are creating otherwise will start shrinking, right? Because one way of responding to it will be that, all right, if 30% of my income is any which way is being taken away, why work hard? Hmm? And if then everyone starts to think, and everyone starts to take that kind of a line, then everyone will minimize their efforts, and consequently the rewards which should have otherwise gone to the ones who are actually slogging will not be retained by the labor. This is something which should be frowned upon. In fact, there are criticisms and theories which have gone as ahead to say that all taxation is theft, right? This kind of Robin Hood approach which the government adopts by taking from the rich and giving it to the poor. Whether Robin Hood does it or whether the government does it, at the end of the day, they say this is, after all, some kind of a forced labor, or to take that other extreme, this is some kind of a theft. Would you agree to this kind of a proposition? Okay, if no, why would you want to not take that kind of a line?
Ma'am, because the people that have
Okay,
worked so
so
hard,
the
or
response is that this argument really doesn't hold much strength to itself. This kind of, very harsh statement that, all taxes is theft. Because, see, after all, you will be taxing people according to what they are earning. The statement is that we would not tax the people who are earning below a certain amount. Very good statement to be made, right? In the sense that you are actually adopting a progressive system of tax. This kind of a statement also is indicative that the kind of tax system that we have is actually taxing your ability to pay, right? And consequently, the more the ability you have to pay, the more you will be taxed, right? In fact, this also leads into those intersectionalities with the economists, who will then keep giving you how you can arrive at a decent system of tax wherein you are taking away from the labor, but not to the extent that you will actually start disincentivizing them. That's one response to it. The other comments which I am seeing in the chat box is that this kind of a dictum that all taxation is theft necessarily also does not hold good, because you are getting something in return for taxes, right? The fact that your government is running, you have courts out there, you have police, there's law and order being maintained, your borders are being protected by the army, right? There is something which you do receive on account of it, right? Now, in fact, even this statement which is coming, right, this observations which you are making is also giving us the other principle which exists, which is the benefit principle, right? The fact that you are paying taxes, you are in return getting some benefit. Now, mind you, since we are into these very foundational understandings, it is very critical to any tax that there is no quid pro quo. Which means that if I have paid a tax today, I cannot compel the government that, look, I paid you so much of taxes. Now, where exactly is the benefit which I receive, right? So, although there is no one on one kind of a matchup, in general, yes, I do as a taxpayer receive these kinds of benefit, right? So the fact that someone says that, oh, you are being actually robbed of your earnings, but this time by the government in the form of taxes, is generally understood to be too harsh a kind of a statement to be made. But let's say if I was someone to say that, all right, I really do not want the facilitations which the government does for me. I can, let's say, afford my own security guard. I start living in a gated community, so I might not even want to step out on the roads which the government, constructs. I might just have my own private chartered, jet and plane and everything. So then, why should I contribute? Because at the end of it, if I put in that labor, then these are the fruits of my labor, and the expectations that I have from the government is that of the minimalist interference, minimalist kind of a regulation. Regulate and provide me a system only to the extent that if something goes wrong, in my business, then I need courts to enforce those contracts. Or if someone comes and robs me, or there is some kind of a fraud which is committed, then it is only to that level that I would need the protection. But otherwise, I'm pretty much kind of a self-sufficient individual, right? I'm pretty atmanirbhar, and consequently, I really don't, wish to make those contributions. Will I be justified in taking that kind of a line? Okay, now here again, I have someone who has already put that statement and that observation. Even this kind of a position, which some of us might wish to take, cannot really be justified. Why? Because in the process of generating income, an individual must have also used public facilities like roads, right? And consequently, to that extent, the fruits of the labor which you see as belonging to yourself alone, right? That assertion, that this kind of entitlement, that whatever I'm generating is my and my contribution alone, does not really hold ground, because it is not, after all, your own efforts. Several other facilitations were provided which enabled you to generate that kind of an income, right? And hence, this becomes an essential contribution, that if you have been able to run the business, the other kinds of activities that you were able to perform is on account of all those kinds of arrangements which are being made for you. And it is, in fact, the societal contribution and the governmental contribution, and hence nobody in as such claim that they are the ones who are this kind of self ownership. Yes, and private property holding to a certain extent allowed, but the contributions being made to the government are essentially appended. Uh, Even when one is taking this kind of a line, right? And hence that kind of contributions which you are being made to pay. One of the things which I can add into this discussion is also to think about it and just reflect that, see, if you had that ability to generate incomes for yourselves, apart from all these contributions, which are the external ones, there is also an inherent element of luck or chance which exist in how you land up in life as you did. The fact that, let's say, you were blessed with this very good voice which made you a top singer, all these kinds of talents with which you were born, the fact that you were born into some kind of a a privileged family which nurtured those talents, or they provided you with good education, good health care, right? Good amount of support for yourself, is also something which cannot really be seen as the sole contribution of the individual alone, right? Now, the moment you say that there is also a whole lot of matter of chance which is involved in there, it is right that those who are not similarly situated must also have something to themselves, right? You bring in that entire Rawlsian, justice and fairness related arguments in here to say that, all right, if you were behind the veil of ignorance, and being behind that veil, you did not know what kind of a situation in which you will land subsequently, what kind of system or arrangements will you agree to? You would ensure that there is some kind of a, the basic minimum kind of a facilitations which are there for you, right? So that even if you could not afford, let's say, private healthcare, there should be some, government hospital at which you could go and get yourself, checked up, and your illnesses will be treated. If you cannot afford the private schooling, there should be some educational institution where you can very well have access to those kinds of, opportunities, right? If the race has not begun from the same starting point, then to make good those kinds of differences, you will still make those kinds of contributions, because that's the kind of agreement that we all have entered into, right? And hence, even to that extent, this redistribution which is happening, right, of income and wealth, of course, it can always also be supported from the other kind of economics, the fact that concentration of power, whether political or economy, in the hands of few is not something which, as a society, we would want to, flourish. And hence also the existence of taxation is something which remains critical, right? Of course, we have all these kinds of, the arrangements which we subsequently make, right? Whether it has to be regressive, whether it has to be progressive, what quantum to be taken, all those kinds of arrangements will be made by the, theorizing which economists will do for us. But as a normative grounding that we lay out for ourselves, taxations do have these kinds of justifications to themselves. That's one. Uh, Even in terms of, right, there's this very interesting comment in the chat box, which is also questioning these kinds of inequities which is prevailing between the governments, right? So the observation is that if we have governments which are just making money of businesses, then why tax? We have tax havens also, which are essentially earning these businesses. See, this thought or this observation is something which is very interesting, in the sense that just like we have a social contract, right? The one which is a vertical social contract between the government and its citizens, there is also this kind of, theorizing which has happened, that there do exist a horizontal social contract, this time between the governments per se, right? So in fact, in today's date and time, there is a whole lot of questioning which has happened from the developing countries, especially from the African nations, which is in fact, challenging this unproblematized acceptance of, signing of the DTAAs left, right, and center. The questions that they are raising, which is very much close to this observation which is being made, that the questions about taxation is also about attaining tax justice. The fact that the developed countries have had this kind of upper hand in terms of being capital exporting countries, being vested with certain other kinds of privileged positions to themselves, and then making the developing countries to sign those kinds of agreements which may not really be facilitating their own personal interest, right? And this perception which is being created, that look, the moment you sign these double tax avoidance agreements, it will start bringing investment to you, it is very useful for your trade. Scholarships have begun to come which have been even questioning those kinds of, those hypotheses, right? Now, of course, this is at the level of nations per se, but if we were to come back to this whole questioning about why we need taxes, one, that it is an essential and a very critical element of public financing, that we do in general believe in having a redistribution of income and wealth. because concentration of economic power will, of course, lead to other kinds of difficulties and inequities which are already very deeply entrenched. Third, and the other added layer to this understanding is taxes at times will also help you to regulate. Have you ever pondered around the regulatory aspects of taxes? If anything that comes to your mind as an example here, excise duty to correct the externalities. Yes, the regulatory functions of taxes are often to correct those kinds of anomalies. Alcohols and cigarettes, the sin tax, yeah, right? See, it's like at times as society, when we perceive taxes, perceive certain kinds of consumptions, right? Or certain kinds of behaviors as being not worthy of encouragement, we try to saddle them with these kinds of taxes. Understanding being that if you regulate and you impose heavy taxes, those activities will be discouraged, right? Of course, in reality, we are finding it the other way around, that you impose those taxes no matter what. People will be ready to pay the taxes but still consume those kinds of goods, right? So, in fact, something which was supposed to regulate is, of course, augmenting your revenues, right? Yeah. Number of examples which are coming in the chat box: luxury tax, taxes on vehicles. Maybe you would want to push your community into using public transportation and not have private vehicles to themselves. You might want to impose these kinds of vehicle taxes, right? The road taxes, or even these kinds of parking charges which are often put. The West have very different kinds of concerns. You might have even heard of it. Sugar taxes, or these cola taxes, if you have heard about. I'm sure you would have at some point or the other, right? The idea is that you would want to have these kinds of, the countries which are faced up with these problems of obesity, they would want to tax sugars and cola drinks so that the consumption is regulated. When we speak about regulations, yes, as is being rightly pointed out in the observations and exemplifications right now in the chat box, regulations is not only to discourage, but at times you can also encourage, right? So when you want to promote these kinds of use of electronic vehicles, right, you would want to reduce taxes on them. If you would want to regulate a particular industry, you would want to impose certain kinds of, give some certain kinds of, let's say, subsidizing, not purely speaking tax in the sense, but some kind of a policy which is working behind it to say that, all right, these are the kinds of activities which we would want to promote. So, mind you, the regulatory aspect of tax is also something which will also serve a whole lot of purposes, right? You can look around, you can think about all those kinds of examples as to the activities that you might want to really encourage, and hence you will find that your legislations will often be tweaked in accordance with all those kinds of policy goals. So, what we have as a very good takeaway of our discussion so far is, when we raise these questions of why tax, the answers that we derive is revenue augmentation, wealth or income redistribution, and also to regulate, right? So, you have fair enough kind of justification. Why do we need taxes in any specific system? Now, this also brings us to the second critical question, which I had referred to when we started with the class, is to ask that what exactly should we tax, and when I use this term income tax, how would you define an income, right? How do we understand and what do we understand as income, right? Because the course that we are studying will be having this focus on income tax, right? The question that we ask is, what do we understand by the term income and how exactly do we define it? Yeah. All right. One example which has come is income is something which you earn from your regular business source. Yes. Income is money that a person or a business receives in return for working by providing, let's say, some products or services, or even by investing in capital. Yes, it is. Augmentation in value of something which is owned, reward for participating in any economic activity, increase in the wealth of an individual through various sources, whether it is business or even inheritance, effort which is expended to generate a livelihood. Okay, all of these are the itemized responses of what we see as income, right? It's like when we look around ourselves, we know that what we are seeing is income, but how do we exactly define what is income? The scholars have been struggling to get a pure definition which can also be as comprehensive enough for anyone to be operationalizing the same, right? So in fact, it is often being said that when you look at the income, you know it when you see it, but defining it in a comprehensive way is often a task which is considered as impossible. We tend to have within the literature of whole conceptualizing of incomes attempts being made by the economists, by tax scholars, by legislators, by policymakers, right? And each of them has one or the other point of time struggled to really provide something which is very concrete in nature. More than often, and this is something which we will see when we reach the statutory definition of the income, we find that the definitions are kept open ended. Why? Because if the goals of your taxation system was to augment revenue, redistribute wealth, and all the other things, then it is also very essential that you do not have a very prescriptive kind of a definition so as to then restrict either your sources of financing or to let out something totally beyond the scope of it, right? You don't want to leave out as and at the same point of time you really don't want to be as specific. The intellectual history of trying to define and conceptualizing of income is, of course, you'll find a lot of scholars trying to do that, but we will take into account these very interesting scholars who have been proposing as to how do we define income, or do we need the definition at all or not. One of the very popular authors and scholars who you will come across when making those kinds of surveys and those kinds of literature reviews is the German fiscal theorist named Clean Watcher. Now, this is a German kind of a pronunciation. I don't know, those who might have studied German language might be able to uh, have this pronounced better, but this is like the Clean Watcher. Clean Watcher is the German scholar who was known for discrediting this whole requirement of conceptualizing income. It's very interesting to note what he points out, and we'll try and match it up with how we have then, culminated into the definitions of income in the modern times. He started out with saying that, see, whenever one is trying to put across these definitions of incomes, he says this is a task which is almost unworkable. Starts out by saying that whenever you are trying to capture what is income, one which is for sure is you cannot only confine the income as cash incomes. Whenever you are trying to understand something as an income, one must also look around the in-kind incomes which will come in, right? So for a very simple kind of the sense of the terms, when you say income, it is understood something which is coming in. Now, what comes in is not only cash, but also in-kind benefit. When I use this term in-kind benefit, some very quick examples from all of you. I'm sure you would have it up your sleeves. In-kind incomes, food supplies, good old days when we would have moods in the university and you all could have, after the moods are over, have a party at Alankrita, or those Domino's pizzas that you all were having in the university lobby once someone was there to give you a lecture. Luxury watches which are being gifted, crops which are self-grown by the agriculturist, medical insurance. See, all those kinds of benefits which you are deriving, which may not necessarily be in cash, but you are nevertheless benefiting from it. Let's use the example which Glenn Watcher is giving to us. He says that when you are trying to capture the essence of income, apart from the cash incomes, you must also consider what is known as imputed incomes or psychic incomes. Now, what exactly is this kind of imputed income or this kind of psychic incomes? The imputed incomes, as he proposed, are those kinds of incomes which one can, derive by providing self-servicing. So that if one was to broaden the concept of income, you might even then land up extending it to those scenarios which typically speaks about this, in simplistic sense of terms, a penny saved is a penny earned. The fact that you are staying in your own house and not a rented apartment, and consequently the rent which you save for yourself, the fact that you are providing these kinds of self-servicing, right? You drive yourself to work and you are not actually hiring the services of a cab, or you are not employing a driver for yourself, right? So the salary which you would have otherwise paid to the driver, or the money which you would have paid to the cab, is something which you are saving up for yourself. Hmm? Uh, by those reasons, if you start looking around, you will find that every kind of activity which we do for ourselves, right? We cook food for ourselves instead of hiring a professional cook. We do the household chores instead of hiring a domestic help. Uh, Mothers taking care and parents providing all these kinds of finance and other kinds of related services to their kids, for which you would have otherwise approached a professional consultant, right? This kind of caregiving which parents often do to their children and vice versa, right? For which otherwise you might have hired a medical staff. Shouldn't then all of that also be considered as an income? Now, this is exactly where Clean Watcher says that this will pose highly problematic situation, because by that reason, if you start considering all these activities, your concept of income would have reached such a point where it has become absolutely fluid and ethereal, right? In the sense that you then take that other extreme, and a consequence of it, what you will find is suddenly the poor households or the middle class households who would otherwise prefer to do things for themselves instead of outsourcing it, are suddenly appearing to be rich, right? And this kind of conceptualizing of income is something which is absurd. Hmm? His work is, however, also very popular for an additional, concept and a problem which he flagged, which is known as the Clean Watcher's conundrum, which is with regards to the psychic incomes. The incomes which you apparently will be deriving for yourselves on account of those uh, pleasures which you are receiving by engaging into those activities. And these, he says, are even more problematic. The example which he uses in here is that of, let's say, a secretary to the prince who accompanies the prince at all the places where he stays, right? So you have a prince who is attending a ball, he's attending parties, he's going for hunting, he's staying in these very palatial kinds of quarters. And being the secretary, this person earns an income, but is also, getting access to all these kinds of, luxuries in the life, which he otherwise would not have. By that reason, one could very well say that, all right, if you have a very broad conceptualizing of income, even these are the kinds of gains which that person is making, right? Something very similar, let's say a real life example is that when you get into the law firm and they have these kinds of, getaways, or these kinds of, corporate, get-togethers where you will have nice resorts to stay, this kind of, team building exercise, and the other kinds of refreshments which they would provide, right? Those should also, by that sense of terms, become a part of your income. But the question which Clean Watcher asks is, what if that secretary actually hates doing all of those things? What if it is just a burdensome duty to the secretary to accompany the prince to all these balls, to go to see him, hunting animals, to go and see other kinds of, following up which he does? Will it actually be an income? Because the benefit which you are theoretically trying to ascribe there in reality is not existing, right? Something which we can relate to, let's say you are not a party goer. In fact, you are compelled to be in that corporate getaway because it is mandated by your employer. To then have those kinds of incomes being ascribed to you, and then to make you pay taxes on those kinds of incomes because you have defined your income in this sense of terms, this is something which is found really problematic. Hmm? Um, so, in fact, what is often being stated when it comes to having incomes being defined is that they are unworkable. And in fact, whatever definitions that we are having is basically a political choice. It is a policy choice which is taking into account pragmatic concerns as you try to shape the definition of any income for the statutory purposes. Hmm? We will stop here at this point. We are almost done with the class timing, so you will also need to have your break. Tomorrow, when we meet, we will continue from this particular point. Thank you, everyone, for joining.